The Zendari research station hung in space like a metallic flower blooming against the swirling orange and purple gases of the giant planet Corveth Prime. It was humanity's most advanced xenobiology facility, which, well, considering humanity's track record with understanding alien life forms, wasn't exactly setting the bar astronomically high. But hey, at least they'd stopped trying to communicate with everything through interpretive dance. Dr. Cassie stood before the reinforced transparent aluminum viewing wall, watching three of the most dangerous predators in known space do absolutely nothing except lie there looking pathetic. The irony wasn't lost on her. These Kythak cubs, each roughly the size of an earth tiger but with the muscular build of a nightmare and teeth that could probably chew through the station's hull plating, were supposed to be apex predators. Right now, they looked about as threatening as oversized house cats with abandonment issues. "Day 18, she muttered into her recording device, not bothering to hide the exasperation in her voice. The subjects continue to refuse all forms of sustenance. Nutritional supplementation via IV has kept them alive, but their condition is deteriorating rapidly. Behind her, Dr. Ben looked up from his tablet, his usually optimistic demeanor showing cracks like old paint. Their muscle mass is down another 3% since yesterday. At this rate, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone on the research team knew what happened when the last three members of a species decided to stop eating. The cubs were magnificent, even in their weakened state. Their fur shifted colors like living shadows, deep purples and blacks that seemed to absorb light itself. Their eyes, large and intelligent, held a depth that made Cassie uncomfortably aware she was looking at beings far more complex than lab subjects. The largest of the three, distinguished by a distinctive silver streak across its forehead, lifted its head just enough to look at her before letting it drop back down with what could only be described as dramatic resignation. "Have you tried adjusting the environmental parameters again?" Commander Joss asked, striding into the observation area with the kind of purposeful walk that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else dealing with anyone else's problems. Cassie turned, gesturing helplessly at the wall of data screens surrounding the containment area. "We've recreated their homeworld's atmospheric composition down to the molecular level. The temperature fluctuates exactly as it would during their natural feeding cycles. We've even synthesized the specific pheromone markers from their prey species. And yet, they sit there like they're on some kind of hunger strike," Joss observed, crossing her arms. "Any chance they're just being, I don't know, dramatic?" Ben actually snorted at that. "Commander, these aren't teenagers refusing to eat their vegetables. These are apex predators whose species survived ice ages, volcanic apocalypses, and 3 separate asteroid impacts. Something tells me they didn't evolve a tendency for theatrical fasting. The cubs' homeworld, Kytheron, had been dying when the rescue mission found them. A stellar collapse had turned their system's sun into an unstable variable star, cooking their planet slowly but inevitably. The evacuation teams had managed to save exactly 3 individuals, all juveniles, all orphaned, all traumatized beyond anything in the xenopsychology textbooks, which, to be fair, wasn't saying much. Xenopsychology textbooks were about as useful as a chocolate teapot when it came to actual alien psychology. "The Galactic Council is breathing down our necks," Joss continued, her voice taking on that special tone reserved for delivering bad news. "Ambassador Catherine sent another communiqué this morning. They want results, or they want the cubs transferred to the Centauri facility." Cassie felt her stomach drop. The Centauri facility was where xenobiological specimens went to become data points, very thoroughly studied, very dead data points. "We need more time," she said, knowing how weak it sounded. "Time is exactly what we don't have," Joss replied. "The Council allocated resources for this project based on the promise that Kythak genetics could revolutionize regenerative medicine. These cubs represent the potential to save millions of lives across dozens of species. But they can't do that if they're dead. No pressure there." Cassie turned back to the cubs, who had arranged themselves in a tight triangle with their backs together, a defensive formation that spoke of intelligence and cooperation even in their weakened state. They'd maintained that position for days now, only separating when the medical team needed to perform their daily health checks. "We've tried every known feeding technique for traumatized predators," Ben said, pulling up holographic displays of their previous attempts. "Live prey simulation, they showed interest but wouldn't strike. Pre-killed food sources, completely ignored. Even the synthetic blood supplements that work on every other carnivorous species we've encountered." The synthetic blood supplements had been Ben's pet project. He'd spent months perfecting a nutrient-rich liquid that was supposed to trigger feeding responses in carnivorous aliens. It worked beautifully on everything from Rigelian claw cats to vegan shadow hunters. The Kythak cubs had sniffed it once and then turned away as if personally offended by its existence. "What about environmental enrichment?" Joss asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We've tried everything," Cassie said, waving at the containment area. "Simulated hunting grounds, interactive prey holograms, even recorded sounds from their homeworld. Nothing. It's like they've just given up." The truth was, Cassie was starting to wonder if the cubs understood their situation better than the humans did. Maybe they knew they were the last of their kind. Maybe they'd made a collective decision that existence without their species, their culture, their world, wasn't worth the effort. It was a depressingly human thought to attribute to aliens, but there it was. The overnight shift reported some unusual behavior, Ben said, consulting his notes. Around 0300 hours, all three cubs became agitated. Heart rates elevated, vocalizations increased, but there was no identifiable trigger. "Nightmares," Joss suggested. "If they were human, I'd say yes," Cassie replied. "But we don't know how Kythak sleep cycles work, or even if they dream. Hell, we don't know if the sounds they make indicate distress, or if they're just commenting on the terrible quality of our hospitality." The largest cub, the one with the silver streak, lifted its head again and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl. The other two immediately responded with similar vocalizations, their voices harmonizing in a way that raised goosebumps along Cassie's arms. "They do that a lot," Ben observed. "The vocalization patterns are definitely complex, almost like they're talking," Cassie finished. "Yeah, I've noticed. Whatever they're saying to each other, it's not, 'Gee, I sure am hungry.'" The cubs fell silent again, settling back into their defensive triangle. Their breathing was shallow, their magnificent forms growing thinner each day, despite the IV nutrition. Cassie felt the familiar weight of failure settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. 18 days of the most advanced xenobiological science humanity could muster. And they were losing the battle to simple refusal to eat. It would have been funny if it weren't so catastrophic. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, more to herself than to her colleagues. "Some behavioral trigger, some environmental factor, something." "Maybe," Joss said quietly, "the something we're missing isn't scientific at all." Before Cassie could ask what she meant, the station's comm system crackled to life. "All senior staff to the main conference room. Priority Alpha communication from the Galactic Council incoming." The three humans exchanged looks, that spoke volumes about their collective enthusiasm for dealing with galactic bureaucracy while trying to save a dying species. "Well," Ben said with forced cheer, "this should be fun." Cassie took one last look at the cubs, who seemed to be watching her with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Hang in there," she whispered to them. "We'll figure this out." The largest cub made that purring growl sound again, and for just a moment, Cassie could have sworn it sounded almost hopeful. She was probably imagining things. She really hoped she was wrong about that. Jake was having what could generously be called a perfectly ordinary day, which on Zendari Research Station meant that only two environmental systems had malfunctioned. The Bowie, artificial gravity in Sector 12 was doing that wobble thing again. And someone had definitely been using the atmospheric recyclers to dry their laundry. Again, he was elbow-deep in a particularly stubborn air filtration unit when he heard the voices coming from the xenobiology lab. Now, Jake wasn't the kind of guy who normally eavesdropped on the fancy scientists, mostly because they talked in words that had more syllables than his entire toolkit. But the tone of Dr. Cassie's voice made him pause. She sounded defeated. That was new. In the 6 months Jake had been working maintenance on the station, he'd heard Cassie sound frustrated, annoyed, excited, and occasionally homicidal when dealing with bureaucrats, but never defeated. "Tried everything in the xenobiological handbook," she was saying through the partially open lab door. "And a few things that definitely weren't in the handbook. Nothing works." Jake wiped his hands on his coveralls and glanced through the doorway. The three scientists were clustered around a viewing wall, staring at what looked like the universe's most expensive pet store display. Except instead of puppies, there were three creatures that looked like someone had taken a panther, fed it nothing but protein supplements and bad intentions, then given it a makeover by a goth teenager with a thing for color-changing paint. They were beautiful, in a way that made Jake's hindbrain suggest that maybe he should be somewhere else, preferably behind several locked doors. "The cubs are dying," Ben was saying, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that meant he was anything but. "Their body weight is down nearly 15%. If they don't start eating soon—" "I know," Cassie snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry. I know you're doing everything you can. We all are." Jake had grown up on the Yellowstone Wildlife Preserve back on Earth, before the transport accident that had taken his family and landed him working maintenance jobs in the outer systems. He'd spent his childhood around animals that other people considered dangerous: grizzly bears, wolves, the occasional escaped exotic that wealthy idiots thought would make good pets until reality introduced itself. And right now, every instinct he'd developed in those years was screaming at him. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the lab doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but are those cubs orphans?" Three sets of human eyes turned to stare at him, with expressions ranging from surprise to mild annoyance. Jake was used to that. Maintenance workers weren't exactly consulted on matters of xenobiological importance. "Yes," Cassie said slowly, "they're the last survivors of their species." "Why?" Jake looked back at the cubs, who had arranged themselves in that tight defensive triangle again. Their posture, the way they kept their backs together, the constant low-level vocalizations. "When I was a kid," he said, feeling slightly ridiculous for even suggesting it, "we had a pack of wolf cubs that were brought in after their parents were killed by poachers. They did the same thing, refused to eat, huddled together, just gave up." "These aren't earth wolves," Ben pointed out, not unkindly. "They're apex predators from an entirely different evolutionary tree." "Sure," Jake agreed. "But trauma is trauma, right? I mean, they lost their family, their home, everything they knew. Maybe they're not hungry in a way that food can fix. Cassie was looking at him with the expression people got when they weren't sure if he was brilliant or completely insane. What did you do with the wolf cubs? We showed them how to be a pack again, Jake said simply. They were social hunters who'd forgotten how to hunt socially. So we taught them. How? Jake scratched the back of his neck, feeling more ridiculous by the second. We ate with them. Sounds stupid, I know. But pack animals learn by watching pack behavior. You show them it's safe to eat by eating yourself. The silence that followed was the kind that suggested his audience was trying to decide between calling security or asking him to elaborate. That's, Cassie began, then stopped. That's actually not entirely without precedent. There are documented cases of social learning in pack predators across multiple species. It's also completely against every safety protocol we have, Joss pointed out from behind them. Jake hadn't heard her come in, but commanders had a way of appearing whenever someone was about to do something that violated regulations. Those cubs might be juveniles, but they're still Kythak. One swipe from those claws could disembowel you. Jake looked back at the cubs, who were watching the conversation with what looked like interest. The largest one, the one with the silver streak across its forehead, had lifted its head and was staring directly at him. They don't look like they want to disembowel anyone, he said. They look like they want to die. Another silence, this one heavier. Even if your theory is correct, Ben said carefully, we can't exactly put you in there with them. The contamination risks alone. What if we didn't put me in there? Jake asked. What if I just ate lunch nearby? Let them see that eating is a normal, safe thing to do? Cassie was staring at him like he'd just suggested they solve the energy crisis by teaching the cubs to pedal bicycles. You want to demonstrate pack-feeding behavior to alien apex predators by eating a sandwich in front of them. When you put it like that, it sounds crazy, Jake admitted. But yeah, basically. It is crazy, Joss said flatly. Crazier than watching them starve to death while we run the same failed experiments over and over? Jake asked. That hit home. He could see it in their faces. The frustration, the desperation, the growing certainty that all their advanced science was worthless against 3 traumatized cubs who had simply decided to give up. Look, he said, trying to sound more reasonable and less like a maintenance worker who'd watched too many nature documentaries. What's the worst that could happen? They ignore me completely, which is exactly what they're doing now. Or maybe they show some interest, and you get new data to work with. The cubs had all lifted their heads now, watching the humans with an intensity that made Jake's skin prickle. Their eyes were remarkably expressive. Alien, yes, but holding a depth of intelligence that was unmistakable. The isolation barriers would prevent any direct contact, Cassie said slowly, talking herself through the idea. And we could monitor all vital signs, both yours and theirs. Absolutely not, Joss said immediately. I'm not authorizing civilians to conduct unauthorized experiments with Class 5 xenobiological specimens. Technically, Ben said with a slight grin, eating lunch isn't an experiment. It's just eating lunch. Jake could practically see the gears turning in Cassie's head. She was a scientist first, which meant she was constitutionally incapable of ignoring a potential solution, no matter how unconventional. 1 meal, she said finally. Supervised, full monitoring, and the moment anything seems dangerous, you're out of there. Deal, Jake said, before Joss could object. The commander looked like she wanted to argue, but Jake could see the same desperate hope in her eyes that he'd noticed in the others. They were all grasping at straws, and his particular straw was the only one they hadn't tried yet. An hour later, Jake found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the cub's containment area, unwrapping what was possibly the most scrutinized sandwich in xenobiological history. The cubs had moved closer to the transparent barrier, their earlier lethargy replaced by obvious curiosity. "This feels ridiculous," he muttered into the comm unit they'd insisted he wear. "Most breakthrough scientific discoveries feel ridiculous right up until they work," Cassie's voice crackled back. "Just try to eat normally." "Right. Eat normally, while 3 alien predators watch my every move, and half the station's scientific staff monitors my vital signs. Totally normal lunch break." But as Jake took his first bite, something remarkable happened. The largest cub moved even closer to the barrier, its head tilting in what was unmistakably curiosity. The other 2 followed, arranging themselves in a semicircle facing him. For the first time in 18 days, the Kythak cubs were showing interest in something food-related. Jake took another bite, chewing slowly and deliberately. The cubs watched intently, their earlier defensive posturing replaced by something that looked almost hopeful. "Holy shit," Ben's voice whispered over the comm. "Look at their neural activity." Jake couldn't see the readouts, but he could see the cubs. They were alert, engaged, more alive than they'd been since arriving at the station. "Keep eating," Cassie urged. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Jake finished his sandwich under the most intense scrutiny of his life, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and oddly honored. When he was done, the cubs remained at the barrier, making those soft, purring growls that seemed to be their version of conversation. The silver-streaked cub pressed one massive paw against the transparent aluminum, directly opposite where Jake was sitting. "I think," Jake said softly, "they want to eat with me." 3 days after the sandwich incident, which had already entered station legend as either the stupidest thing anyone had ever tried or the most brilliant breakthrough in xenobiology, depending on who you asked, Jake had become the cub's favorite human. This was both touching and mildly terrifying, considering that their idea of showing affection involved displays of teeth that could probably bite through bulkhead plating. Day 21, Cassie recorded, watching Jake settle into what had become his regular spot outside the containment area. Subject response to human feeding behavior remains positive. Cubs show increased alertness and engagement during meal periods. What she didn't mention in her official log was that the cubs had started timing their activity cycles around Jake's lunch breaks, or that they'd begun what could only be described as greeting behaviors when he arrived. The silver-streaked one would approach the barrier and make a sound that was almost like a purr, while the other 2 would position themselves where they could watch both Jake and their apparent leader. "Today we're trying something new," Jake said, unpacking not just his usual sandwich, but also a portion of the synthesized protein that the cubs had been ignoring for weeks. "If this works, maybe we can get you guys actually eating your own food instead of just watching me eat mine?" The cubs had arranged themselves in their customary semicircle, but Jake noticed something different. Instead of the tight defensive positioning they'd maintained for weeks, they were more relaxed, sprawled out in a way that spoke of comfort and trust. Trust. In him. A maintenance worker who'd stumbled into their lives by accident. No pressure there. Jake took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully while the cubs watched with the intensity of food critics at a 5-star restaurant. Then, very deliberately, he picked up a piece of the synthesized protein and bit into it. It tasted like cardboard soaked in beef broth, but Jake managed not to make a face. Much. He said, knowing he sounded ridiculous but committed to the performance. Delicious alien food really hits the spot. The largest cub, Jake had started thinking of him as silver, though he'd never admit that to anyone, tilted his head with what looked suspiciously like skepticism. "Okay, fine, it tastes awful," Jake admitted. "But it's good for you. Probably. The smart people say so anyway." To Jake's amazement, Silver made a sound that was unmistakably amused. The other cubs joined in, creating a harmony of what could only be described as alien laughter. Are they laughing at me?" Jake asked. "If they are," Cassie's voice came through his comm, "it's the first documented case of humor in Kythak behavioral patterns. Keep going." Jake took another bite of the protein supplement, exaggerating his chewing motions. The cubs watched intently, and Silver began to approach something that had been sitting untouched in their enclosure for days, a portion of their own food. "That's it," Jake encouraged softly. "Just like me. See? Eating is fun. Eating keeps you alive. Eating means you get to stick around and make fun of the human who's talking to himself." Silver sniffed the food, looked at Jake, then back at the food. The moment stretched out like a held breath, the entire observation team watching in silence as weeks of scientific effort balanced on the actions of one traumatized alien predator. Silver took a bite. It was a small bite, tentative and careful, but it was food entering a Kythak digestive system voluntarily for the first time since their arrival. The other two cubs immediately moved closer, and within minutes, all three were eating. Slowly, cautiously, but definitely eating. "Holy mother of xenobiological breakthroughs," Ben's voice whispered over the comm. "It's working. It's actually working." Jake felt a grin spreading across his face that was probably visible from orbit. "Good job, guys. I knew you could do it." Silver looked up from his meal and made that purring sound again, but this time it sounded different. Less desperate, more content. Over the following days, a routine developed. Jake would arrive for his lunch break, the cubs would gather at the barrier, and they'd eat together. Not just once, but for all three of the cubs' daily feeding times. Jake found himself adjusting his work schedule, taking breaks at odd hours, all to maintain the feeding schedule that was slowly bringing the cubs back to health. "This is unprecedented," Cassie said during one of their daily briefings. "Not just the feeding response, but the social bonding. They're treating Jake as a pack member." "A pack leader," Ben corrected, reviewing the behavioral analysis data. "Look at the posturing, the deference patterns. They've accepted him as the alpha." Jake, who was trying to fix a malfunctioning air recycler while listening to the meeting, nearly dropped his wrench. "Alpha? I'm not an alpha anything. I'm a maintenance guy who eats lunch with them." "You're the one who taught them it was safe to eat again," Cassie pointed out. "In pack dynamics, that makes you the provider, the protector, the leader." "Terrific," Jake muttered. "I always wanted to be responsible for the last three members of an extinct species. Really rounds out the resume." But despite his sarcasm, Jake couldn't deny the growing attachment he felt to the cubs. They were intelligent in a way that was both alien and familiar, their personalities emerging as they regained their strength. Silver was clearly the leader, cautious but decisive. The smallest of the three, Jake had started thinking of her as Whisper because of her quiet vocalizations, was the most curious, always the first to investigate anything new in their environment. The third, who Jake called Rumble for his deeper voice, was the protector, positioning himself between his siblings and any perceived threat. They were individuals, not just specimens, and they were starting to trust not just Jake, but the world around them. Which made the emergency klaxon that began blaring on day 26 particularly unwelcome. "All senior staff to Docking Bay 1, the station's AI announced. Priority diplomatic vessel incoming. Jake felt his stomach drop as he saw Cassie's face go pale. Ambassador Catherine, she said grimly. The Oversight Committee. They're early. How early? Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. 3 days early, which means they're not coming for a routine inspection. She was already moving toward the lab, her expression grim. They're coming to make a decision about the cubs. Jake looked at the cubs, who had noticed the change in their humans' behavior and were showing signs of agitation. Silver was pacing, the other two staying close to him in a protective formation that spoke of intelligence and emotional sophistication. What kind of decision? Jake asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach already knew. Whether to continue the project, Joss said, appearing in the doorway with the kind of expression that meant bad news was coming, or whether to transfer the cubs to a facility that can make better use of their biological resources. The euphemistic language didn't hide what they all knew. Transfer meant dissection. Study meant death. Over my dead body, Jake said quietly, surprised by the intensity in his own voice. That might not be entirely metaphorical, Joss warned. Catherine isn't known for tolerance of irregular procedures. When they find out we've been letting an uncredentialed civilian interact with Class 5 specimens, then we don't tell them, Cassie said firmly. Jake's breakthrough is the only reason the cubs are alive. Whatever Catherine wants to hear, we give them the standard xenobiological explanation. You want me to lie to a Galactic Council ambassador? Jake asked. I want you to stay alive, Cassie replied. And I want the cubs to stay alive. If that means creative interpretation of our methods, then so be it. Silver approached the barrier and pressed his paw against the transparent aluminum, right where Jake was standing. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, a communication that transcended species barriers. He knows something's wrong, Jake said softly. They all do. Pack animals are sensitive to stress in their group, Ben observed. They're reading our emotional states. Jake placed his own hand against the barrier, opposite Silver's massive paw. Through the transparent aluminum, he could feel the warmth radiating from the cub's body. Silver made a soft sound, almost questioning. It's okay, Jake said, knowing it was probably a lie. We'll figure this out. But, as the diplomatic vessel's docking clamps engaged with a resonating clang that echoed through the station, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The cubs had learned to trust again, to eat again, to live again. Now they had to learn to survive bureaucracy, which, Jake reflected grimly, was a predator far more dangerous than anything that had evolved on Kytheron. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt like getting ready for battle. Cassie and her team worked frantically to compile data that would make their feeding breakthrough sound like the result of careful scientific methodology rather than a maintenance worker's lunch break epiphany. Jake found himself scrubbed out of reports, his interactions with the cubs described in clinical terms that made him sound like a controlled environmental variable rather than a person. According to our official records, Cassie said, reviewing the sanitized documentation, we achieved feeding compliance through a combination of social modeling protocols and graduated environmental enrichment. Social modeling protocols? Jake asked, trying not to laugh. Is that what we're calling eating a sandwich? It's what we're calling saving your life and theirs, Joss replied curtly. Catherine's reputation for dealing with protocol violations is comprehensive. Jake spent his supposed final feeding session with the cubs trying not to think about what might happen to them if the ambassador's visit went badly. The cubs seemed to sense his mood, staying closer to the barrier than usual. Silver kept making soft questioning sounds, while Whisper actually pressed her face against the transparent aluminum as if trying to get closer to him. "You guys have gotten attached, haven't you?" Jake said quietly, careful to keep his voice from carrying to the monitoring equipment. "Makes two of us." Rumble, who rarely showed much emotion beyond protective vigilance, approached the barrier and did something Jake had never seen before. He lowered his massive head in what was unmistakably a gesture of submission and trust. Not the submission of fear, but the acknowledgement of pack hierarchy that Jake had seen in wolves back on Earth. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake promised, hoping it was true. "Whatever happens with the fancy aliens in their fancy ship, we'll figure it out." But even as he said it, Jake could hear the docking procedures completing, could feel the subtle vibration through the station's hull as the diplomatic vessel settled into place. Ambassador Catherine was here, and with them came the power to decide whether the Cubs lived or died. The Cubs seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. As Jake prepared to leave for what might be the last time, all three of them lined up at the barrier in a formation he'd never seen before. Side by side, heads raised, looking for all the world like they were presenting themselves for inspection. It was a display of unity, of strength, of dignity in the face of uncertainty. Jake felt his throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Show them what you're made of," he whispered. "You're the last of your kind, but you're not giving up. Not anymore." Silver made a sound that might have been agreement, or farewell, or promise. Jake chose to believe it was all three. Ambassador Catherine was exactly what Jake had expected a galactic bureaucrat to be. Tall, imposing, and possessed of the kind of cold efficiency that suggested they'd never met a regulation they couldn't weaponize. Their species, the Veltar, looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a tax auditor and given the result delusions of grandeur. "Dr. Cassie," Catherine said, in the kind of tone that made ice cubes seem warm. "Your progress reports have been optimistic. I trust you can substantiate these claims of breakthrough feeding compliance." Jake watched from the observation deck above the main lab, officially present as Station Maintenance Oversight, but really there because Cassie had refused to let him hide during what might be the Cubs' death sentence. The Cubs themselves were arranged in their formal presentation stance, looking every inch the magnificent predators they were supposed to be. "Absolutely, Ambassador," Cassie replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Our social modeling protocols have achieved a 98% feeding compliance rate over the past 8 days. "Social modeling," Catherine repeated, making notes on a device that probably cost more than Jake's annual salary. "Elaborate." Jake held his breath as Cassie launched into an explanation that managed to describe everything he'd done without actually mentioning that he'd done it. She talked about controlled exposure to feeding behaviors, environmental enrichment through observed consumption patterns, and graduated trust building through consistent behavioral modeling. It was all technically true. It was also complete bureaucratic nonsense that made Jake's breakthrough sound like the result of careful scientific planning rather than dumb luck and sandwich-based empathy. "Impressive," Catherine said, though their tone suggested they found it anything but. "I would like to observe a feeding session." "Of course," Cassie said smoothly. "Ben, if you would prepare the standard nutritional supplements." Jake felt his stomach drop as Ben moved toward the Cubs' enclosure with a tray of food. This was the test. Could the Cubs maintain their new feeding patterns without Jake present? He'd been with them for every meal for over a week. Their entire recovery was built around his presence. The Cubs looked at Ben, then at the food, then toward the observation deck where Jake was standing. Silver made a questioning sound that carried clearly through the lab's audio system. "Curious," Catherine observed. "The subjects appear to be seeking external validation before feeding. This suggests dependency rather than recovery." Jake's heart was pounding. The cubs were looking for him, waiting for the signal that it was safe to eat. Without him, they might revert to their previous behavior, proving to Catherine that the breakthrough was temporary at best. Ben placed the food in the cubs' enclosure and stepped back. The cubs approached it, sniffed it, but didn't eat. They kept looking toward the observation deck, toward Jake. "As I suspected," Catherine said with satisfaction, "temporary behavioral modification rather than genuine psychological recovery. The subjects remain fundamentally compromised." "Give them a moment," Cassie said desperately. "They're just adjusting to the new routine." But Jake could see the cubs becoming agitated. Silver was pacing, Whisper had retreated to the back of the enclosure, and Rumble was making distressed vocalizations. Without Jake's presence, they were reverting to their traumatized state. "That's enough," Catherine declared. "I've seen sufficient evidence. These specimens are psychologically damaged beyond recovery. They will be transferred to the Centauri facility for biological resource extraction within 48 hours. "No," Jake said, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "You can't do that." Every head in the lab turned toward him. Catherine's compound eyes fixed on him with the kind of attention that generally preceded very bad things happening to very small people. "I beg your pardon?" the ambassador said in a voice like liquid nitrogen. Jake knew he was about to end his career, possibly his life, but the cubs were looking at him with those intelligent eyes, waiting for him to make everything right again. He couldn't let them down. "They're not damaged," he said, stepping down into the main lab. "They're traumatized. There's a difference." "And you are qualified to make this distinction how, exactly?" Catherine inquired. "Because I helped them recover," Jake replied, walking toward the cubs' enclosure. "The social modeling protocols Dr. Cassie described? I'm the model." The silence that followed was the kind that generally preceded explosions. Jake could feel Joss's glare boring into his skull, could sense Cassie's mixture of admiration and terror. But the cubs had noticed his approach and were moving toward the barrier, their earlier agitation replaced by obvious relief. "You?" Catherine's voice could have frozen hydrogen. "A maintenance worker? You claim to have achieved what trained xenobiologists could not?" "I didn't achieve anything," Jake said, reaching the barrier where Silver was already pressing his paw against the transparent aluminum. "I just ate lunch with them. They did all the hard work." To demonstrate, Jake sat down in his usual spot and pulled out the sandwich he'd been saving for his regular feeding time with the cubs. The change in their behavior was immediate and obvious. They relaxed, moved closer, and began showing interest in their own food. "They're pack animals," Jake explained, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Social predators who lost their pack. They didn't know how to eat alone, so I showed them they weren't alone." Silver picked up a piece of his food and began eating. Within moments, the other two cubs had joined him, their feeding behavior natural and relaxed. "Remarkable," Catherine said, and for the first time, their tone held something other than bureaucratic displeasure. "You established pack bonding with an alien species through simple behavioral mimicry." "Through not letting them give up," Jake corrected. "They're not just specimens or biological resources. They're people. Different kind of people, sure, but people. They have personalities, relationships, emotions. You can't solve trauma with science alone. You need empathy." The cubs had finished eating and were now arranged in their relaxed formation, watching the exchange with obvious intelligence. Silver made a soft sound that Jake had learned meant contentment. "Your methods are completely unorthodox," Catherine observed. "They're also completely successful," Cassie interjected, finding her voice again. "The cubs have gained back 60% of their lost body weight. Their psychological indicators show steady improvement. They're not just surviving, they're thriving." Catherine studied the cubs for a long moment, their alien features unreadable. Then they turned to Jake, with something that might have been respect. "You have established yourself as their pack leader," they said. "In Kathak's social structure, this creates obligations on both sides. They will not accept separation from their pack." "Then don't separate us," Jake said simply. "You're suggesting permanent assignment as, what, xenobiological pack integration specialist?" Jake couldn't help but grin at the ridiculous title. "Sure, sounds better than guy who eats lunch with aliens." Catherine actually made a sound that might have been amusement, a clicking noise that suggested even galactic bureaucrats weren't immune to absurdity. "Very well, but this arrangement will require extensive documentation, protocol development, and—" They paused, looking at Jake's coveralls and tool belt. "Significant wardrobe adjustments." "I'm not wearing a lab coat," Jake said immediately. "The cubs know me as I am. Start dressing me up like a scientist, and you'll confuse them." "The cubs," Catherine observed, "appear to have trained you as much as you've trained them." It was true. Jake had learned to read their body language, to understand the subtle differences in their vocalizations, to recognize when Silver was being protective versus when he was just showing off for the others. He'd learned that Whisper was actually the most intelligent of the three, her quiet observations often leading to innovations in their play and problem-solving. He'd discovered that Rumble's protective nature extended to anything he considered pack, including Jake, which had led to some tense moments when medical staff tried to approach too quickly. "The fascinating aspect," Cassie interjected, clearly seeing an opportunity to establish the scientific value of Jake's work, "is that this represents the first successful case of cross-species pack integration. Jake hasn't just rehabilitated them, he's become part of their social structure." "And they've become part of his," Ben added, consulting his tablet. "His stress hormones dropped to baseline levels during feeding sessions. His sleep patterns have improved. There's measurable psychological benefit to both species." Catherine made more notes, their expression thoughtful. "The implications for other trauma recovery cases could be significant. We have several species in various facilities across the galaxy dealing with similar psychological damage from habitat loss, conflict, family group dissolution." "You want to expand the program," Jake realized. "I want to understand it," Catherine corrected. "Your methods, while unorthodox, have achieved results that traditional xenopsychology has failed to replicate. If we can develop protocols based on your approach—" "You can't protocol empathy," Jake said firmly. "That's the point. These guys didn't need more science. They needed someone who cared about them as individuals, not as specimens." Silver chose that moment to approach the barrier again, but instead of pressing his paw against it, he did something that made everyone in the lab freeze. He placed both front paws against the transparent aluminum and stood up on his hind legs, bringing his face level with Jake's. It was a gesture of equality, of recognition. Pack leader to pack leader. "Extraordinary," Catherine whispered. "He's acknowledging you as an equal, not a superior. That level of interspecies social sophistication. That's Silver saying, 'Thanks for not giving up on us,'" Jake interpreted, meeting the big predator's gaze. "Right, buddy?" Silver made a sound that was definitely affirmative, then dropped back to all fours and padded over to where Whisper and Rumble were watching. The three of them arranged themselves in their relaxed formation, but this time they were facing outward, toward the humans, rather than maintaining their defensive positions. "They're presenting themselves as part of the station community," Cassie said in amazement. "Not as specimens being observed, but as residents being visited." It was a subtle but profound shift in body language that spoke of security, of belonging, of home. 3 months later, Jake stood in the newly expanded Kythak habitat, watching his pack, and yes, that's how he thought of them now. Teach the first group of xenobiology. Students, his methods. The cubs, now healthy adults, had become the foundation for a new approach to interspecies trauma recovery. Silver approached and nudged Jake's shoulder with his massive head, a gesture of affection that still made visiting scientists nervous. Jake scratched behind the alien's ears, marveling at how far they'd all come. "Good job today," he told Silver, who responded with that purring sound that Jake now knew meant amusement. His official title was indeed Xenobiological Pack Integration Expert, which made him laugh every time he saw it on his personnel file. But the job was real. The cubs were thriving. And somehow, through the simple act of not eating alone, they'd all found their way home. Pack animals, Jake had learned, took care of their own. Whether they were wolves from Earth or the last survivors of a distant world, that truth remained constant. And sometimes, that was enough to save everyone.